Welcome to the Real Bible Rub podcast. I'm so delighted to have a professor of mine, an ex-dean of mine, Roger Naum here, and Roger is the professor of Hebrew Bible at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, and he was the dean of Portland Seminary when I was studying there, when I was getting my MDiv. And while Roger was there, he reached out to some of the Presbyterian students. We were in definite minority at the school, and we had some connection there. And I felt connection with Roger because of we have a similar technology background, and also and he was talking about Ezra and Nehemiah and some of the studies that he was doing and a book that he was writing, and I was so puzzled. Why do we Presbyterians ignore this and the other Second Temple period books? So he wrote a fascinating book in 2020 that was published in 2024, the theology books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and it shows why we should pay more attention to this. So that's why I asked Roger on, and thank you so much for coming on, Roger. It's a real pleasure to see you.
Rob, it's so great to see you. Those are the good golden years, right? And you had two Northwest Presbyterians who were in tech. And so it was really great to make that connection to reconnect
Yes.
now through your podcast.
Yeah, move on to more important things in life, right?
Right, right. Who wants to do tech? Who wants to do semiconductors?
That's what I say. Yeah, semiconductors has their place, but
They had their place for me from 1997 to 2000. And then just kind of,
yes.
I left that world. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I was there a little bit longer, but yeah, but that was definitely a point of connection. And the other one was is being Presbyterian,
Right.
and just that the good and the bad and the ugly of all of
Hmm.
that. So
Yeah.
thank you for that, and I really appreciated as dean how you reached out to make those connections. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your history, and what brought you into biblical studies, because I'm fascinated when other people have made that transition.
Yeah, especially direct from tech, which is kind of a unique thing for me. Yeah. So I was born and raised in California, and I actually grew up in a Christian household in the South Bay near San Francisco.
Hmm.
Went to church throughout my life, was involved with youth group, went to college, and at some point felt a calling to ministry.
Hmm.
And a pastor, an American Caucasian pastor, actually encouraged me, like, you have a gift of being Asian, and if you want to do ministry, it's important to relate to people and explore
Yeah.
that part of you. It's actually from that conversation I decided to go to seminary in Korea, and I ended up going
Oh.
to,
Hmm.
at the time, was probably the largest Presbyterian seminary in the world. We had about 400 incoming students, all
Wow.
preparing
Wow.
for Presbyterian ordination, and it was actually during that period I fell in love with Reformed theology, not as
Uh-huh.
this is the right theology, but it helped me make sense of my life. It helped
Ah.
me make sense of things that happened, just certain views of sovereignty of God. It was very profound for the way I thought about my own relationship with God. And yeah, I did my MDiv. I ended up going back at home, taking a break from ministry, and that's when I entered Maximum Integrated Products to be a
Oh, okay.
financial analyst for integrated circuits. And after 4 years of that, and this is the late 90s, right? Remember the Pentium processor came out like the mid 90s, mid
Yeah.
mainstream. And so this was a hugely big growth time in hardware. But I just didn't like it.
No,
I just,
I
I
get
just
it.
thought, it wasn't fun. It didn't feel fulfilling. I had great
Yeah.
coworkers, but
Yeah.
Monday through Friday, there was no remote work at my company. We had to show up and just grind
Yep.
it out at the cubicle.
Yeah.
And this is under the most best economic circumstances. We exploded in
Yeah.
growth in
Right.
those 4 years. And at that point, I just decided that, you know what, I really enjoyed studying the Bible. I'm just going to go for it and try to become a Bible
Uh-huh.
professor. And after 7 short years of full-time graduate work, I ended up with my first job at Portland Seminary.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay. Wow. Now,
yeah.
so when you did your seminary in Korean, was that all Korean language
It
instruction or?
was, yeah, it was all in
Okay.
Korean language. And so I didn't do very well. I was, at the time, I didn't care about grades. I just wanted to be a pastor as long
Uh-huh.
as I could. And so, yeah, my I failed being Hebrew and
Oh,
Old Testament introduction, and yeah, my grades weren't
that's
that
hard to
good because
believe.
I did. I have an F. It's on my transcript. I saved it.
Wow. Because obviously you're a Hebrew expert now. So I mean it's kind of like, well,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe second time worked better.
Yes, just took a little bit of time. Yeah, it took a little
Yeah.
bit of time.
And where did you do your studies in the United States then for
Yes, so I left industry and I did a master's degree at Fuller Seminary and I did my PhD at UCLA. And so
Oh, okay.
yeah, and UCLA, it wasn't theology, it's much more traditional like
Yeah.
Bible and Hebrew and Semitic languages and things like that. And that was kind of it fit. I didn't take any class in theology. It was all mostly like different ancient
Uh-huh.
languages and archaeology.
Were you with Bill
Yeah, Bill
Schvindeman? Yeah.
Schneedewind. Yeah, I brought him
Yeah.
back to Portland Seminary a few times to kind of
Yeah.
deep drop and do some lectures and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah, he's wonderful, and I love his book too. Well, the one book
yeah,
I have of his, yeah. So, wow, that is so cool, and it made me realize. I think that we had another professor at was that Melissa Ramos?
Melissa Ramos. Yeah,
Yeah, who came
yeah,
from UCLA as well. So,
yes. She's part of the Schneedewind lineage. Yes,
yes,
absolutely.
yeah, which is great, right? Super academic background and everything.
Yeah,
So. Yeah. So, in your book, and, and it was something we talked about. What did you say? 7 years ago, 8 years ago, and a long
yeah,
time
yeah.
ago, about that in betweenness, about being
Right.
a Korean American, and the challenges, what it was like to take your kids to Korea for
Hmm.
a period, and then that not really being American, not really being
Hmm.
Korean feeling. And it's something that when I talk to parishioners who are immigrants, they talk that way. So, can you describe how, how does that relate to your study of Ezra and Nehemiah? And
Yeah.
was that part of the reason why you chose to do those studies?
Yeah. So I wrote my first book on First and Second Kings, and I was going to write more on that for my second book. And then I made a pivot to Ezra and Nehemiah. And the reason for that, you mentioned return to Korea with my kids. It was 2014. I had a sabbatical from
Hmm.
Portland Seminary, and we did a full year in Seoul, Korea. And I returned with my third generation Korean American boys, and coming
Hmm.
back to Korea, imagining how much it's changed in the 47 years since my mom and dad left in
Yeah.
1967. So 1967 Korea was nothing like Korea now. It was
Yeah.
really poor country. There's no K-pop, no Blackpink, no
Right.
BTS.
Yes.
Nobody knows about Korean food. It's still very war torn. The war ended in the
Yeah.
1950s, and I just imagine in 2014 I had to go to my father's home district in Seoul to register, and just all the big buildings.
Yeah.
You've seen
Yeah.
it, all the
Yeah. I've been
wealth,
there.
and
Yeah.
just imagine coming back. So it was 47 years between myself returning and when my parents first left for America in 1967
Wow.
to 2014. And it was 47 years between the Babylonian exile and the first return
Oh.
of return migrants back to Jerusalem. And I thought, wow. And I even called my mom to verify the dates. And it just sparkled and catalyzed imagination for what a
Oh.
profound transition. And I that book that I was supposed to write never was written, and it still needs to be written. And I ended up writing this other book on Ezra Nehemiah and
Uh-huh.
focusing really about 10 years of scholarship on Ezra Nehemiah commentary coming out because I thought there was such a unique context of return migration and
Yeah.
people who were in between. They're Judean, but they never been there until they heard stories from their grandparents. But they also grew up in
Yeah.
speaking Aramaic in Babylon or another place in the diaspora, and they came back. And it's such a profoundly complex formation of identity that dealing with that they're not
Yes.
fully there, but they are, and they have language issues and generational issues. I
Yeah.
thought that was such a wonderful platform for me to explore, kind of modern notions of identity through Ezra Nehemiah.
I think that, yeah, and it's such an amazing thing is that it was the grandchildren, right? That
Right,
maybe some of the children, but grandchildren and great grandchildren that were sent back or
right,
returned.
right. Yeah, and
You
look,
know,
most of them had never ever been on the land, and this is before internet. This is before pictures. They just
yeah.
heard stories about Jerusalem from their grandparents, many of them who had already died, and just to imagine that shock. And I remember sitting in Korea and just thinking about my dad when he left in 1967.
Yeah.
He actually never returned to Korea. He died in the United States, having never been back.
Oh,
Most of his family came to the United States. I just remember how shocked he would be at the transitions and change in
yes.
Korea in those 47 years. And it helped me think about the experience of the Judeans as they returned to Jerusalem 2 generations after the exile.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Yeah, and I have a little sense of that because I used to go to Korea for business quite a bit.
Right. I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we go and yeah, I mean Seoul is like a super city, right? And we would take because we would visit Samsung. So we would
Hmm.
take the train or we would take the car down to oh, I forget what the other cities were. Daejeon and
Daejeon. Yeah.
a few others. Kumi and
Yeah.
um and yet you kind of do see a little bit of the old Korea in these
Right.
places, right? And you go, yeah, the whole country was like that. And yeah,
Yep.
wow.
Yeah.
And just this huge change. And
Right.
yeah, so I wonder, yeah, would your father have been upset by
I
what Korea would
don't
be like?
know. I don't know. He left Korea. He had attitudes towards the American dream. I think a lot of those attitudes were shattered. And I actually think that is part of Ezra
Oh,
Nehemiah. They come with this great hope.
interesting.
They're in this tragic place of exile. They're really owned and tortured by the Babylonians. And they, well, Jerusalem, everything's going to be great. And they
Yes.
go, and as
Uh-oh.
soon as they get there, the elders are like, they start weeping. They start crying. This is nothing like,
Yeah.
and so we know archaeologically, Jerusalem was still devastated for many centuries after exile. It was a
Hmm.
shadow of its former self. It was depopulated. Buildings are probably still razed to the ground. The temple is not standing. They build this tiny kind of sad makeshift altar. And it's the elders who remember the first Jerusalem that are sad. And this is actually a phenomenon in all sorts of return migrations where the memory is
Yes.
constructed out of just this hope that might be utopian, not realistic. And once they actually are
Yeah.
there, it's sort of shattered. So I don't know how my dad would have felt about that, but certainly I think he would be amazed at how strong Korea's become, at least
Yeah.
economically.
Yeah, that is amazing. Yeah, I wonder how much of that has to do with even the narratives we have in our own
Right.
in the United States about the lost that the past and the
Yeah.
mythical past, right? And so forth, and how much people want to grab for that. Um,
Yeah, so a lot of my parents' generation, they're thinking of 80 something Koreans right now. They have this really idyllic view of Korea, the past in the 1960s and 70s. Well, I
mhm.
know the 1960s is a military dictatorship. It was
Yes.
very poor. It was rampant corruption all over the place. But I think the reflection of the past is so much more an indication of who they are now, like
Yeah.
what their present struggle. And so, an example, if I were to say, "Hey, Rob, tell me what you were like in high school,"
Yeah.
it tells me less about where you grew up, your high school. It tells me more about
Yeah.
you now. If I ask
Yeah.
you to tell me what you were like, it's reflective of the present in different ways. And I think this is happening as these return migrants are talking about their return and the construction of the temple and the wall in
Yeah.
Nehemiah.
For sure, yes, and also you also highlight quite a bit about the people who stayed behind, which where I think were
Mm-hmm.
mostly the elites were taken to Babylon, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And what that's like. So I want kind of before we get there, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about why Ezra and Nehemiah or how it's used. Evangelicals tend to idealize it quite a lot.
right.
And then we Presbyterians or we critical, historical critical people tend to sideline it quite a
You're
bit.
right.
And that was certainly an experience that I had in seminary that we were talking about. The seminary or New Old Testament professor, blew my mind, going, "Well, wait a minute, you're
Mm-hmm.
me as a Presbyterian, just as biased as the people who look at
Yeah,
it
yeah,
otherwise."
yeah.
And so, and you said something to me back then. I go, "Why the heck would you want to do these books?" And you said that was your purpose. That was your
Yeah.
purpose was to, yeah. So can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. So in Ezra Nehemiah, it's the only account of people the narrative account of people coming back after exile, going to Jerusalem during this long period of the Persians. Like there are other narratives like Esther,
Hmm.
Daniel's Babylonia, but this is the only like narrative account that kind of continues the act from First and Second Kings or Chronicles about what happens to this group in that sort of format. And I think it's very unique in giving this perspective of this kind of new theology. Like,
Yeah.
so one example, Ezra Nehemiah almost never talks about David. Chronicle talks about David all the time. Kings talks
Yeah.
about David all the time, and it almost never talks about David. And so the very opening verses of Ezra 1 1 through 4, it talks about the Lord stirring the spirit of Cyrus. David is
Yes.
nowhere to be found. And I think there's a theology of how can we exist as a people of God, even though we're under the political control of the Persians, of foreigners, of
Yeah.
pagans and stuff. And how can, and it gives ideas on how they can maintain identity in God and how that identity be lasting and powerful, and even more so than what they would see to be the Persian Empire. And it's so interesting to kind of see, like, wow, Cyrus is
Yeah.
stirred up by the Spirit and not David. And everything they do, they don't critique the Persian Empire at all. They concentrate and think about their own community.
Uh-huh.
Yet within this empire, it implies there's a freedom that we can be true worshipers of God within this space. And I think that's part of what makes this such a rally point for certain strands of evangelical, this triumphant return to Jerusalem and
Hmm.
taking over and being partitioned this land and building this temple and building a wall in which no other foreign elements will be able to come inside
Yes.
this wall. And the wall is, reinforced with the census. So Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7 are two of the most boring chapters in
Yes.
the Bible, but it kind of it's a theology of the wall, who's included and who's not,
Uh-huh.
is part of what's happening
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Well, I often say that is that scholars get more information out of these boring sections than the
Yeah.
average reader does because they can make these connections. So that's what you've done is you
Yeah.
see,
Yeah.
yeah, how
So
they think
Ezra
about themselves.
2 is the very beginning of the Ezra Nehemiah, considered really
Hmm.
one book. Ezra 2 is the beginning, and then they construct the temple, then they construct the wall, Nehemiah, and it finishes with Ezra 7. They're almost exactly the same lists. And
Oh,
then in
okay.
Nehemiah 7, and then Nehemiah 8, they read the Torah to solidify and have a ceremony to make this, to mark the community. So it's about inclusion. And I think
Yeah.
that's why those long names are there in Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7.
Yeah. And the reaching back. So it is, I was wondering, so is there kind of a transference of loyalty that, because like you said, now was Chronicles, I know it's later when you look at a Hebrew Bible, it's always at the end. Does that
Right.
mean that it was written before Ezra and Nehemiah or after, or how does that
Yeah,
work?
so until about the 1960s, most people thought Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah are written by the same person or the same group of scribes and
Okay.
stuff like
Yeah.
that. Now, very few people think that, and part of the reason is there are different theological themes. A lot of
Hmm.
the thought was not that they're the same writer, but they're writing at the same period, this kind of, fourth century era where Hebrew is a
Yeah.
little bit different from, you see, for example, in Deuteronomy. And part of the example is, Chronicles is just absolutely obsessed with the Davidic Empire,
Yeah.
and Ezra Nehemiah is not at all. So there are really two different perspectives. Chronicles is this retrospective, like, look how great the history of Israel is, and these kings, and like the
Yeah.
ones that obeyed and the ones that disobeyed. And David is the best, or at least his line. And Ezra and Nehemiah is like, how can we be faithful children of God in the midst of foreign kings? And that's kind of a different
Mm,
perspective that they bring
yeah.
upon. But yeah,
So Chronicles is more about reviving that loyalty or reviving something maybe later.
reviving and in making sense, because Chronicles is written, we have sources for Chronicles and Samuel and Kings, but
Yeah.
it's written at a time when the Davidic dynasty is eradicated. So that's
Yeah.
really interesting.
Yeah.
But what are people doing? I think they're creating this important memory, this rallying call, like, hey, we may be exiled now, but we have this great heritage, and this heritage will come back. We just have to hold
Mm.
out a little bit. We have this wonderful king that was blameless. David is essentially blameless in the book of
Yeah.
Chronicles. He does one bad thing, a census, but it says Solomon is blameless in the Chronicles, not the
Yes.
experience in Kings as well. So they're projecting this idealized reign
Hmm.
in a time when the reign has ended, which is super interesting. But talk to people that are suffering and
Yeah.
are reaching out for hope, in the ways that they can construct hope as a means of perseverance, resilience, and survival. And I think that's what makes Chronicles such a valuable text. And Ezra and Nehemiah, similar, as a valuable text for
Yeah.
those people that are suffering politically and economically.
I think I've heard before is that, yeah, Chronicles was written to a disappointed people. Is that a
Yeah,
fair
for
thing to
sure.
say?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, because it's written, they're using the text of Samuel. So think about Second Samuel 7. It's
Hmm.
saying, hey, your house is going to be forever, your kingdom is going to be
Yeah.
forever. And then it's not. Like both the dynasty and the temple is gone. So they're very disappointed. So I think Chronicles is a way of how do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of God promising the Davidic dynasty is forever, but yet it being destroyed? How do we make sense that Jerusalem will always be protected, the temple will always be there, but we've seen it be burnt to the ground by the Babylonians? So it's kind of a resilient theology of God that extends stronger things like holiness, the idea of God being so big that he cannot dwell in this one place.
Yeah.
Not even, and so you have development of this kind of more um, this vast projection of God that is so non-earthly, that is so big that we
Yeah.
cannot conceive of him being, constrained to one particular location.
So that's very interesting. Is that sort of an extension of the tension that we see pre-exilic between
Yeah,
the Sumerians and the Judahites, and how
yeah,
they, yeah, one
sure.
wanted said you could build temples anywhere, and the other one say no, 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 those are in high places, and we
Right.
have the one true temple. So is it
Yeah,
similar?
yeah. And so we actually absolutely, so archaeologically, we know there are temples everywhere during the time of ancient Israel. They're popping up all the time. And even recently,
Yeah.
they're popping up pretty close to Jerusalem. We have altars ever. So we know there was worship on a lot of different places. We also know that about the seventh century, there's a movement, in the eighth century as well, there's
Hmm.
a movement to centralize the worship. Like this shrine is no good, that shrine's no good, but Jerusalem, this
Yes.
place will be where
Yeah.
the true shrine is. And you have notions of that in the talk about Hezekiah, in
Uh-huh.
Josiah as well.
Yeah.
It also coincided when there was a threat of invasion, so it made political sense to consolidate
Right. Yeah.
control and centralization and resource, and you can do that through religion. And so, yeah, there's absolute tension in which you have this language in Deuteronomy, for example, the place that the Lord chooses. Well, that's code for Jerusalem. Like Jerusalem is the place, and
Yeah.
other places where there's shrines there and here, and like but it's certainly one of the ways that you see the tension in the Old Testament. Like, where is God located? And then at some point, it's clear that God is located in Jerusalem. Then all of a sudden, the Babylonians take over in 2 Kings 25 and
Uh-huh.
destroy the contents and plunder the goods. That was unthinkable. You see that reflected in the prophet Jeremiah. And so
Yeah.
Chronicles, Ezra Nehemiah is giving like, wait a second, it's not that they were false, but we can imagine being children of God in the midst of another, even Persian empire. We can
Yes.
imagine a return and that God is not constrained, but it's really in other ways that we can worship God. And we don't have to be in Jerusalem to worship God.
Yeah, yeah, but there's this desire. Well, Melissa Ramos talked about the Northern Hypothesis, the idea that as the Assyrians were coming down and kind of people were escaping Assyria,
Mm-hmm.
moving to Jerusalem, and the and that was may have been part of that consolidation into
Yeah,
Jerusalem. Is that
absolutely.
true?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, she's absolutely right. So, because in the eighth century, for example, we know that the population in Jerusalem exploded in size, and it doesn't
okay,
happen in natural childbirth in antiquity is like 1%, but exploded in
yeah,
size. They had a second portion, and yeah, these were surely refugees from northern Israel that were fleeing the
yeah,
Assyrians, and Jerusalem is actually well fortified naturally with valleys on three different sides at the time, now two
yeah,
different sides, and so there was a place where they can find some sort of hope and refuge. And it worked in the eighth century. They warded off the Assyrians, and that's documented actually
yeah,
in Second Kings and also in the Syrian inscription as well. They held off. And so people really believe, wow, Jerusalem really is a sacred city. We held off the Assyrians, the mightiest
yeah,
army that the world had known. And of course, about 120 years later, the shock will actually, Jerusalem will go down by the Babylonians this
yeah,
time. And so very disappointed people, but there's such survivorship in the theology of Chronicles. They still believe. They're just trying to make
yeah.
sense of these promises of Jerusalem and Davidic dynasty, knowing that the temple is destroyed, knowing that the Davidic dynasty is ended.
Yeah, I've often told people that one of the neatest experiences is to drive from Tel Aviv up to Jerusalem
Oh yeah,
because you can see, or the other way, coming from Jericho,
Hmm.
it's even more dramatic, right? Because you go up 2,500 feet, it's surrounded
Hmm.
by ravines and valleys, and you go, oh, so if you were a farmer down in the valley, or Plain of Sharon or Jezreel
Hmm.
Valley or whatever, you're going to be in a very different place when you come to Jerusalem, which is
Right.
easily defendable. And the other thing is it's always like 10 degrees cooler in Jerusalem too, you know?
Yes, yeah, it's higher. It snows in Jerusalem. And now that we have a car society in America, you get a sense of elevation. But if you walk or run or ride your bike, like you
Uh-huh.
feel it when you're walking. So, the Psalm of Ascents, I think that
Hmm.
might have something to do with pilgrimage because you're like walking up to Jerusalem, getting
Yes.
closer and closer to God, or even within the city. You know that the temple was held at the high point of the city. And there's something about feeling it with your body. So you drive.
Yeah.
I've done the drive from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. In the summertime, you'll see a lot of cars overheating at the side of the road. You don't
Yeah.
sense it. You can see it with your eyes, but if you do it with your body, you can actually truly sense, wow, we're going higher and higher. It's a great analogy about that car ride.
Yeah, yeah, it's just you wonder, like when Jesus or Galileans or whoever went to Jerusalem up to the temple, it must have been an incredible experience
Yeah,
to feel that going up feeling.
right,
Yeah,
right. And seeing maybe other pilgrims doing the same thing, and the whole act of leaving your family and leaving your fields and labor because you need to make that sacred journey to Jerusalem. And what did it feel like to arrive there with
yeah,
all the other people and to have sight of the temple and you'll have limited
yeah,
access and to be able to conduct sacrifices and
yeah.
yeah,
And it still has that feeling when you're there.
sure, sure, yeah,
You're someplace special, and
yeah.
yeah, wow, that's so cool. I think that so well, and also I get the sense too is that for the Babylonians to come in and destroy Jerusalem, it was no small feat.
Right,
It's
right,
they really they were well, and we learn after Josiah, right, that the leadership was completely co-opted by and the
right.
vassal of Babylon. Um, so
Yeah.
I yeah, um, I there was a little part that you wrote about sort of a deep dive into some of the complications of funding and taxation and
Mhm.
things like that to get for the reconstruction of the temple, but then also the wall, right?
Right, right.
I was wondering if you could kind of explain the ups and downs of that, because like Cyrus sent them and go do it, right? And then
Mhm.
Artaxerxes or Xerxes
Artaxerxes, yeah.
pulled back, and then Darius. So could you kind of explain that a little bit from why
Yeah.
that's important?
So you have to think about construction and of a wall, a construction of walls built by stone, and you have to quarry the stone. And so if you were to go just even try carrying a big rock, to and just try to construct a stone out of rock, it's a lot of work. You need to feed these people too. You have to do all this stuff. There's
Yeah,
money has not been introduced in Israel at this point. And so you have to like force this labor as well. Same with the temple. If you
right.
have all these implements made of gold, it takes a lot of funding to do that. And so if you look at Ezra Nehemiah, it seems to be that the Persians are doing this funding. But if you look closely, there's a really important chapter in Nehemiah 5 where
Mm.
it realizes they're actually in a pretty precarious situation. So Ezra and Nehemiah is generally pretty positive economically, but Nehemiah 5, something slips out because they are losing their children to debt slavery. So they're going to debt.
Oh,
They're going to
yes.
debt in ways that is so precarious that they need to put bonds in there. And the bonds are usually their children, and they're
Yeah.
not going to repay. So what we know about the society takes different levels between Cyrus and Artaxerxes and Darius and different places, but they all are, Jerusalem is under control. All of Judah is under control of the Persian Empire. And
Hmm.
therefore, the Persians offer protection and permission, but in return, the Judeans need to give part of their produce and goods and
Yes.
taxation to the Persians. And it's so far away that you can't do that without being somewhat complicit. So it's not like they're
Yeah.
just sending Persian people. They're working with Judeans to extract taxation and give it to the Persian Empire. And it's a really complex thing. And so what you do see in there, you have to realize this was an economic system which is exploitative, and the
Yeah.
most exploited are the poorest. That they are working the land, and their first duty is to give to King Cyrus or Artaxerxes of Darius. Their second one is to the Persian overlord. Their third one is to the Judeans, we're
Yeah.
extracting that as well. And so whatever they have left. And also realize that being a farmer is precarious. You might have a full year with drought and
Yeah.
like zero product. You might have pestilence, all the references to locusts in like
Yeah.
prophetic books. That's kind of outside your control. And so it's a world where it's very economically precarious. And I think that needs to be understood when reading things like Nehemiah 5. I will
Hmm.
say it's well known from later history, Herodotus, that Darius was someone that really put really deep, complicated taxation. And
Uh-huh.
it wasn't just give me this or give me that, but really different tiers of taxation.
Hmm.
You see reference of this in Ezra 4:13. It talks about people like tribute, a road tax, or in a labor tax. There are different labels of tax. And what that is, it's just a way to extract more and more complex ways, a way to be more oppressive. So it was a really hard life. And
Yeah.
so this ability and desire and this hope and optimism, like, hey, we are the children of God. So if you read like Nehemiah 9, which is one of the longest Psalms in the
Hmm.
Bible outside of the Psalms, it's a really powerful thing if you understand this as an economically oppressed group
Yeah.
that is living under the thumb of the Persian Empire, yet they have so much pride in the history of God in their lives and calling on them to be
Oh,
faithful in the midst of
uh-huh.
that. So it's a pretty powerful to understand that economic exploitation happening under these different kings
Yeah.
onto the people of Ezra Nehemiah.
So is that part of the division between the people who were left behind and the returning
Yeah,
exiles was the
yeah,
social stratification that,
absolutely. And just think about like me returning to Korea and my third
yeah,
generation kids. Like there's gonna be some, oh yeah, good to see you. But imagine like no contact. Like, who are you?
yeah,
like like which one, like you're not Korean, you don't even speak our language well,
oh
like
yeah,
you have American names, you have weird names, you worship and pray differently, you don't even know like there's a certain divide. You can imagine that between
yeah,
those who never left and those that came back, especially knowing that and you have reference to this in Kings and Jeremiah, that it was the poorest of the land that stayed behind, and it was
uh-huh,
the elites, the scribes, and other people like that who actually were the ones exiled back in Babylon. So it's all these different dynamics that you can imagine even today of those that never left and those that are coming back.
hmm, hmm, yeah. And so it, it is, you talk quite a bit about the mixed marriage crisis,
Right.
a lot. In fact, I was kind of surprised that it was such a big part of your book.
Yeah.
And does that fit with this at
Mm-hmm.
all? Also, you kind of talked about Ruth, the Book of Ruth, which I guess most people think was written after these books. Um, and I guess just if you could kind of explain
Sure.
the
Yeah.
mixed marriage crisis.
Yeah, I could. Yeah, I actually didn't want to talk about it too much because so controversial. Like all the foreign wives are banished,
Hmm.
and stuff. It's really hard theology, and but my editors in conceiving this book that I think this is really central, and of course, I tend to now agree after kind of reading through this careful. And so the summary is at some point like, what are we doing? And it's always about
Hmm.
Judean men marrying foreign women. It's never about Judean women marrying foreign men because those women have already gone. It's all an economic thing.
Yeah.
So Judean
Yeah.
men with foreign women, that means the uh, estate and the inheritance will go and be lost from Judah if it's with foreign women. And so it's a pretty violent thing where they banish them out and the kids,
Uh-huh.
and they have no social net. And so try to understand that is theologically problematic for those that have faith in scripture. It's really ugly and it's really
Yeah.
terrible. And I think it's very fair to assume that they probably died because they
Yeah.
didn't have that social net or food. So it's also been used in terrible, terrible ways in Christian interpretation, whether, between mixed marriages and interracial dating and interracial
Yeah.
marriages and things like that. Ezra Nehemiah has been cited in court cases in U.S. history for that. Um, but I think what I think is going on is a confluence of things, and one is understanding identity protection. I'm saying nothing about the
Hmm.
modern ethical implication,
Yeah.
but I think it's a statement about trying to have some sort of identity protection. I think it's a statement about keeping wealth within Judean family lines, and I
Yeah.
think it's a place where we can problematize this and kind of mourn that this is within the Bible because it's really very misogynistic and racist to do this
Yeah.
in these ways. And that's why I kind of bring in Ruth a little bit because the book format asks me to talk about other texts. there's an idea that Ruth, as a foreign woman, widow, a Moabitess, to have favor of God, that was brought in to be a balance to the extreme, harsh
Yeah.
penalties on marrying foreign wives that you see in Nehemiah 13, Ezra 10, other places like that. And so that I think makes sense in the canon. It's you cannot take one set of circumstances from Ezra and Nehemiah and make this broad hermeneutic, but maybe help you understand the
Yeah.
mentality of these returned migrants and the severity by which they are trying to control identity, and certainly not as a hermeneutical norm or ethical norm
Yeah.
for today's society.
Well, you mentioned Jonah, I think briefly,
Mm-hmm.
as God's favor
Yeah.
on foreigners. You also mentioned oh gosh, it just left me. But the, in the book of Esther, of course, which is a
Yeah.
polemic uh, against the Persians, right? So this
Yeah.
is sort of a uh, yeah, we love Cyrus, and so there's so much about Cyrus, and kissing up to the Persians, right? And then we see, so it's a wonder. I wonder about that too. Is this multivocality in Scripture? It's
Yes.
it, you know
Multi-locality is perfect
we
to
see
say
it right
that.
now. Yeah, we see it in
Yeah.
what we just said, but I'm also thinking about people like Jezebel and Ahab.
Hmm.
Was the strong polemic against Jezebel, is that part of this purity? We don't like foreign women coming in and telling us what to do.
Right.
Is there a
Right.
similarity
Absolutely.
there? Or can
I
I
think the
draw that?
multivocality, yes, absolutely. I think the multivocality is a good way to say it. The Bible is not one book, but it's many books. And
Yeah.
even within the books, there are different competing perspectives. So Ezra Nehemiah is all about we're immigrating to the back to Jerusalem. It's about forming, maintaining identity as children of God. And that's why you cannot over theologize the wall as a normative, the census list in Ezra 2, Nehemiah 7. And that's why other books like Jonah and Ruth that have a more universal take
Yeah.
of God is the God of all nations. And
Yeah.
the really fascinating thing that I put in there is actually Ezra 6:21, and they're about to
Mhm.
celebrate the first Passover. It's
Yeah.
not just open to the returnee Judeans, it's open to anyone who worships the Lord of all the nations. They're welcome, which is stunning for the first Passover celebration within the book of Ezra Nehemiah.
Yeah.
It's so hyper focused on this one returning community. Even within the book of Ezra Nehemiah, there's tension between the true community and the openness of
Uh-huh.
the community. And so it really leads me to problematize some of the modern rhetoric we see in America about, for example, wall building,
Yeah.
about keeping things pure and keeping things foreigners out. And I think you're really cherry picking a very one specific voice in scripture that's done to an oppressed people trying to maintain a certain identity in the midst of this transition. And you're kind of, what about the book of Jonah, who's concerned about the Assyrians? What about the book of Ruth and the
Uh-huh.
Moabites? And what about these different texts like Ezra 6:21, which the actual Passover is open to anyone who worships the
Wow.
Lord, not
Yeah.
just to the Judeans.
You can't imagine that, and maybe even before that, right? About
Yeah.
foreigners being invited into the sacred
As long
aspect
as
of it.
you
Yeah.
worship the Lord, that is the condition. Nothing
Yeah.
about specific borders or nationality or ethnic identity.
So, how is so I get a sense that Ezra and Nehemiah is used triumphally and used badly by many
Mm-hmm.
Christians in America. I was wondering if you could kind of describe what we get wrong when we
Yeah.
do that.
I think there's a lot to think about. Like, first of all, Ezra Nehemiah it's very clear that they are operating within a greater polity, a greater control. They're not
Hmm.
America or Germany or England. They're like number 90 or 120 on the GDP list or 140.
Yes.
They're
Yeah.
tiny little group of people without even their own land. And it's really hard to imply, this triumphalism because think about what hope means to a smaller country, a smaller group or impoverished person
Yeah.
compared to those that are relatively wealthy. I think another idea it's not to be this blueprint for this democratic movement of leadership and assigning things, but maybe I would, challenge Americans to think about developing empathy that are those in a migrant journey. How does
Hmm.
it feel? There's so much that relates to those that know the migrant experience, first, second, third generation, about identity formation, about poverty. There's
Hmm.
generational difference. There's like in Ezra 3 with the elders and the young people having completely different reactions. In Nehemiah 13, where Like this is every Asian American kid where they're stressed out that, oh my goodness, they're losing Mandarin or they're losing Korean or
Uh-huh.
they're
Yeah.
losing their mother language. And there's this conflict because English leads to success, but the mother language is so
Yes.
close to your heart. And
Yeah.
there are aspects of even, how do we this is what I get when I talk to some Jewish scholars, where they're like, a lot of Korean families, they want their kids to marry Korean. Well, same as
Uh-huh.
I talked to this Jewish scholar, and she said, when my daughter didn't marry Jewish, I can't explain why. I just was so disturbed by that. And we're actually talking about Nehemiah 13, the mixed marriage at the time. There was nothing that she didn't like about this guy. There's nothing that she felt was good to protest, but she just didn't like her marrying a non-Jewish guy. So there's all those aspects. And I think reading Ezra Nehemiah is a chance to really understand both those of our neighbors that face these experiences, but also one's own. I taught Ezra Nehemiah at a church, a 4-week series at a Korean church, and it was
Hmm.
wonderful. I also taught it in an Atlanta church that was predominantly, I think, 100% in my Bible study of 70 people, Caucasian. But they
Uh-huh.
were able to go back to their heritage, where they're Polish or
Oh, uh-huh.
Italian or
Yeah.
Irish, and kind of remember these stories and
Yeah.
resilience of their own. So I think it's a wonderful place to unpack some of those own narratives and understandings of yourself and those in your congregation.
Yeah, no, yeah, it seems to me that one of the weirdest things when people think of Americans identifying with the Israelites, like they're us, without
Mm-hmm.
realizing, no, we're really the Babylonians or the Persians or whatever. And
Right.
without, and sometimes I've spoken to people in my community here in Seattle, has a very large African
Mm-hmm.
immigrant. And so
Right.
you talk to these people, and they're from these small African nations, and uh, they're puzzled. They're puzzled by this American thing is not understanding how dominant we are,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, for
And
sure.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a really wonderful place to kind of sit and just read the text, kind of understand like why is it that the olds and the youngs are what does it mean that they're one is just crying and one is just so happy and joyful, but you can't even distinguish the two, and they're all
uh-huh,
experiencing the same thing. What is it like to have your children lose their mother tongue, and what kind of
yeah,
mixed feelings do you feel? Was it like when you feel your child marries someone that maybe you don't want them to marry and that they might lose a
yeah,
certain part of their identity and heritage? What does it mean to read together
hmm,
Nehemiah 8 and read together the Torah and have it be translated? And what kind of example is that in which some people are understanding Hebrew, but not everyone can, but they're going to translate it anyways. And everyone is so that excited. And the real triumph is in Nehemiah 8 when they're reading
yeah.
Torah and they have that. It's not in the construction of the
Because they have
wall
to
to
learn an
build the
old
temple.
language, basically, right?
Yeah,
To
yeah.
study
At
it.
least the
Okay.
younger people, a
Yeah.
language that they're not familiar with, that they're not speaking.
Yeah. Was Aramaic mostly the language of the period
Yeah,
or?
they use the word Ashdodite in
Okay.
Nehemiah 13 that everyone speaks Ashdodite, but it's probably some form of it stands for some form of Aramaic, and it's kind of
Okay.
the cipher because Ashdodite is a Philistine language, and so you can kind of highlight Hebrews the
Oh,
not holy language, like oh my goodness, they don't speak the holy language, they're speaking this
yeah.
Philistine language. That's kind of what that Ashdodite is a language, but they're really referring to some form of Aramaic.
Oh, okay. Well, that's very, and I've heard that said that like Job and some other maybe Daniel as well, when the portions that are written in Hebrew sound old-fashioned-y and difficult and aren't as fluid as other Hebrew writings. Is that true? Is that what some,
Yeah,
yeah.
you could actually distinguish that's kind of controversial. I think you could distinguish this in Hebrew. Hebrew, like any language, if you were to read Old English, you wouldn't understand it very well.
Yeah.
And compared to King James English, compared to modern English, and Hebrew is more resistant to change, but you can tell periods. You could
Yeah.
tell earlier Hebrew, later Hebrew. You could also tell when late Hebrew is trying to look old. So
Yeah.
if I were to give an assignment, write a song but use King James English, you could probably sniff it out. It could, you put in some
Yeah.
ye's, thous and stuff like that, but you could probably sniff it out. In fact, in ancient Israel, people were doing the same time, trying to write Hebrew in an older fashion in order for it to feel more
Authoritative or
archaized and
yeah.
authoritative. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've even heard that said of the King James Bible itself, is that it was written in a kind of an awkward way to sound
Mm,
more authoritative that,
yeah.
people at the time didn't. speak that
That's
way.
absolutely,
So
yeah, yeah, absolutely. They're using those tricks in the Bible too, and especially in early
yeah,
Judaism.
interesting. I mean, it's so interesting to make that parallel there. And I guess I know it's kind of a touchy subject, but when we talk about
Mhm.
Israel Palestine and identification of modern people to these ancient people, what should we say about that? When can we uh, talk about Palestinians or modern
Yeah.
Israelis in that context?
But even though the land is the same of Ezra and Nehemiah, even Jerusalem's the same as it resides in modern Israel today. I think you have to be very careful with extrapolating anything with direct symbolic importance, especially as Presbyterians who look at the Bible as being sacred. I
Hmm.
think you want to look for broad, sweeping things. I think Presbyterians should be concerned with the residents of Gaza and wanting
Yes.
healthcare and food and water and electricity and protection, and to be mortified at the deaths of innocents there. I think Presbyterians should be concerned with the families of Israelis who were kidnapped and murdered on October
Yes.
7th. And I think there's room to not be super one sided, but just to build off broad compassion in both realms. I think we can look at the Bible and see conflict and evidence of conflict, especially over certain sacralized spaces. But also, I think the
Hmm.
ethic is beyond who gets what land. I think that's really problematic in all sorts of ways. But I see a real deep regard for compassion in human life, especially the most marginalized human life that there
Yeah.
is. And I think that's what I hope Presbyterians can take for that, and not to kind of fall into a trap of a very simplistic understanding of this crisis, and to be very generous and wanting compassion for anyone who's hurting, whether you're Israeli and
Yeah.
Palestinian. And to be, I don't think there's a lot in terms of modern, approaches to this contested land, which is whether it be in Gaza, the West Bank, or other places in Israel right now. I think the idea of compassion, the most
Hmm.
marginalized people that God favors, and to try to exert things that would bring more of their physical needs to those populations.
So there's tremendous I think there's tremendous value in really understanding those first, for chapter one of Ezra and
Mhm.
the returning exiles and so forth. And it seems to me a bit harsh what Ezra says about
Sure.
the people who are kind of resisting them, the people left behind. How should we read that? Should we uh, and I imagine that people think, well, this is like, the returning Israelis to in Palestine over the last century or so, and
The, this
yeah,
is how I know you're a good pastor, Rob, because you're asking these very difficult questions that I hope you're asking to your congregation. How do we read that? And the answer, I think, is I don't know, but I think God wants us to struggle with that.
yeah,
Like, wow, I think scripture is not something, if we take scripture seriously, we need to read it seriously. And that means our reaction, I think, is much more than like, yes, I will do that, but like to real struggle, like, God, I don't like Ezra. Like,
yeah.
I
Ezra
don't
seems
like that
pretty mean.
response.
Yeah.
And I think it's done damage, and to be grieved by that and yet still have faith uh,
Hmm.
that this is the word, the reflection of the word of God in some way. And I think part of the reading strategy for me would be try to really understand, and I think it's a good strategy for today to like really understand Ezra's point of view. Why is Ezra doing this? What is it about him that we know? Like, he's a passionate person. He's a
Yeah.
scribe, so he knows Torah. He's in this really deeply difficult mission as well. He works for, like, why is he like this, and why is he like this externally? Is he different, like in his own bedroom by himself? Is he saying this as part of a platform? And I think that's part of what makes a sophisticated reader, to both have critical complaints on the text, on the hero in Ezra, but
Hmm.
also to really take some humility and try to understand that point of view. And say with Nehemiah, like, why
Hmm.
is Nehemiah doing these things? He was a cupbearer to the king. A cupbearer is a terrible translation. He was like a cabinet member. He was
Oh,
very high
okay.
up there in some
Yeah.
place, and he was had everything in the king's court, but chose and tried to travel all the way back to Jerusalem to help construct this wall, and met with different forms of resistance. And so I think that would be my opening way, just to begin with those places of having this humility of the text, of like, and also be able to question, not just accept it as well. Like, oh, this really grieves me. There's
Uh-huh.
so much in Ezra Nehemiah for a Bible believing Christian, that should be troubling and difficult. And I think
Yeah.
just to be in that trouble and to understand it, I think that's the way you honor the text.
Yeah, and it's such a good lesson. I wonder if for those who read the Old Testament as one narrative, when they run into this, or they run into parts where they don't, where
Mm-hmm.
it's clearly something that we would not want in our
Yeah,
communities, right? How can they still love the text, be faithful to the text, be a believer even,
mm-hmm.
and give up on this idea of a single narrative,
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, you know, what is the truth? Well, like certain ways to read the text, I think they're not wrong, but really thinking through. I think if you're looking at the text as keys to life and that's it,
hmm
or how I am to behave or how I'm to think about Gaza on October 7th, I think it's a very impoverished view of scripture. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, scripture comes to us in prophetic charge and hyperbole and poetry and rhyme and liturgy and narrative
Uh-huh.
and boring administrative documents. And I think to fully understand that, like it should touch with our emotions. We should let scripture read us as well. And
Uh-huh.
so I think that it's not to systematize this is how God wants you to act. It's much deeper than that. And so that's what I would encourage people of faith to read the Bible with those things in mind. You're not going to get answers
Yeah.
that you might want. You're not going to say like this is the major you like teach undergrads. This is the job you should have at 22 if you read,
Yeah.
Jeremiah. Like there's not going to be for some reason they want it, but that's not going to be there. But there are teachings in the Bible that will help you be close to God.
Yeah.
Um,
If you don't come out of graduate school more confused than when you went in, you probably didn't pay attention, right? So
you didn't pay attention enough. Yeah.
um so I guess finally here a bit about the presence of God. I spoke to Beverly Gaventa a couple weeks ago, and the thing that I really got out of my conversation with her about Romans, it was she she kept coming back to what we as Christians have missed in Romans is not realizing so much of the language was about the presence of God in the Hilasterion, the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, and we've made everything a theological, systematic theology about how do you get to heaven kind of thing.
Mhm.
Eh, So I was wondering about, because you mentioned that a little bit in the book about the presence of God and how that mattered to them and
Yeah, yeah.
what that mattered and the place of Jerusalem, the place of the temple. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So God's not really doing much in Ezra and Nehemiah. Like
Yeah.
he's like, it's not, there's no theophany, there's no appearance of God on earth.
Uh-huh.
You know, it's really when God does something, it's in the past. A large of this is when they're talking about what God did in the past. And a lot of that is actually relegated to Nehemiah 9, that long prayer, like God did all these things.
hmm
And so it's really kind of this transcendent God and less of an eminent God that you'll see,
hmm
for example, in Abraham. Another parallel might be Joseph. God isn't doing anything in the Joseph narratives from Genesis 30
Yeah.
to 50, but it also says in Joseph, but God was present. And so I think this is what you're getting with Ezra and Nehemiah, a God who is not really in the weeds. You don't see God. He's not
There's
appearing to
not there's
anyone.
not a
He's
lot
not
of
even drawing it.
miraculous things happening, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think God is still present. And I think that's really
hmm
powerful for a community that's suffering and grinding every day and trying to make their taxation and working the land and being impoverished by this foreign polity because they could say, hey, we need these three sons to work on the king's project for two
hmm
months. You lose them. Like, how do you feel that God is absent? But there's such an emphasis on this subtle, maybe distant presence of God that you don't see in Abraham and Jacob narratives as
Yeah.
well. And I think that's so powerful to think through the context of the people of the return migrants coming back to Jerusalem and
Uh-huh.
seeking out the clues and having faith that God is still present, even though we might not see God at this time. Remember, He did all these things in the past. That same
Yeah.
God is still present with us.
Yeah, interesting. Kind
Yeah.
of like us. We don't we It's hard for us to discern, or to see God sometimes, and we need to be reminded and
Right.
about the presence of God rather than this system, you know.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I would say especially for those like the economic context of Ezra and Nehemiah is so stark to me of being impoverished. But even for those in congregations that are they have great jobs and saving, but there's something really dark in their lives. They're going
Yeah.
something through something really tough, and God feels very distant. And I think Ezra and Nehemiah, when you develop this empathy of how hard life was, they could become very powerful for how you can feel and have faith in the presence of
Yeah.
God, even though God seems so far away at that particular moment.
Yeah. What a great lesson for that. Yeah. Wonderful. Is there anything else that we should know? Why should we fall in love with these books?
I think it will help you know your neighbor. It'll help you know. So here's a fun fact, Rob. I think the largest Presbyterian church in Georgia is Korean, and they get
Oh,
about 2,000
uh-huh.
on a Sunday. And most of the services are in the Korean language. And so here in the South, what I'm learning, oh my goodness, there are huge churches that like buildings, huge
Yeah.
buildings everywhere. And in the main lines, Episcopal, Presbyterian, Methodist, they're not fully at capacity on Sundays, I would say. And that's the
Yeah.
most generous way to put it.
Yes.
But PCUSA, the immigrant churches are flourishing. If you
Yeah.
don't go to my church on time, you're not going to get parking.
Yeah.
You will not get parked. They're parking on
Yeah.
lawns, on streets, and I think it'd be important for the denomination to kind of think like, hmm, who's making the makeup of churches and where is their growth?
Yes.
You have a Presbyterian church with multiple services with no parking, and people are struggling to find worship space every Sunday.
Yeah.
I'm actually preaching actually this Sunday, and the second service is in the kitchen because there's no other space. They decided to put this small
Uh-huh.
young adult English service in the kitchen, and like, okay, I guess we'll preach there, which is a wonderful problem to have, and such a contrast to a lot of the churches that are massive with space, but they
Yeah.
don't have the congregants. And I think understanding that story, I think, will be very important strategically, and also as you are your brother's keeper. If this isn't your experience, I think Ezra and Nehemiah can help you, and maybe
Ah, okay.
God
Yeah.
could have come to you during your time when you have a parallel experience.
Yeah. Yeah. That is so important. How do we make the church um uh move forward in a way that invites all of these people and
Mm-hmm.
invites the people who want to hold on to what they used to think. I mean, because there are going to be some of those, and the
Sure.
ones who want to push the church, into social justice directions and stuff like that, and without leaving other people behind. It's a struggle.
Yeah.
So, so maybe part of that, maybe that's part of the real value of these books is to show they struggled too, and they struggled with who do they include, how do they include, can they be inclusive, and
And
so
it's
forth.
right in the text, the very opening verses. It's about a migration. It doesn't spend a lot of time, but it's all fronted with it's great migration from Babylon
Yeah,
to Jerusalem that took probably several weeks, and it was women and children, and
right.
it wasn't the soldiers. It wasn't on huge fast donkey caravan. It was just they walked
Uh-huh.
all the way, and so it fronts. And I think that's the reading strategy for this book. This is a migration document, and
Hmm.
so I think there's great value in learning about this in terms of your own narrative, but also in terms of how can we make the church hospitable for people that have the same experience.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Roger. It was just such a delight and enlightening for me and hopefully for people who are listening. And thank you so much for taking your valuable time for this and giving us your insight.
Rob, it's always a pleasure. It's so good to see you again. I love seeing you all over social, and you're doing such a wonderful job in kind of these little snippets of data and information to interrupt people's feed that are, I think, really valuable. So I appreciate your congregational ministry and this ministry as well.
Thank you so much.